Hey everybody, OperationZ here, and we're continuing where we left off in Joseph's story. And we're on part 13 now, and we pick up where we leave off with, Joseph being there in the prison, and the chief butler and the chief baker of Pharaoh have a sort of, they offend Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So he puts them both in ward in the same prison that Joseph is in, overseeing. And the warden of the prison, or the keeper of the prison, keeps, basically, he has Joseph to pretty much watch over and tend to the needs of the chief butler and the chief baker, because pretty much Joseph oversees everything. And, while they're in prison, they're still considered people of honor and, to be deeply respected and things like that, because they were high class people and men of Egypt. And, they were in there, and Joseph was tending to them. And he sees that they're of a sad countenance, and he asks them what's wrong. And each one of them had a dream. And in their dreams, basically, they had them, and Joseph interprets their dreams, the dreams of the chief butler and the chief baker. And when he does that, it's as a good thing for the chief butler, and it's a bad thing for the chief baker, who 3 days from that time gets hung on a tree. And he tells the chief butler pretty much just, hey, remember me, and when you see Pharaoh, just let him know I'm in here, and I want to get out of this prison that I'm in and just be a free man again, like I was. And pretty much just get out of the situation he's in. But the chief butler didn't remember him, and he just went about his business as usual when he was restored his butlership, just like Joseph predicted that he would. So that's where we're at here. He forgot all about Joseph. And we continue in Genesis chapter 41, verse 1. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. So first, what we can note right here, Pharaoh had a dream, and not that part yet, but that it was 2 full years. So he was stuck in prison for 2 more years. Joseph was, being around 30 when he's, basically that's how old roughly that he is 30 years of age, going into this slavery / prison type stuff that he's going through, right? Basically for that long, from 17 to 30 years of age. And then he goes into what he goes into next, but he don't get to this point until shortly after this comes to pass, what we're going to read through. So at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. So Pharaoh's having a dream now, and he's in the dream realm, so to speak, and he's standing by the river. He's just standing by the river, and this is what he sees next. So Genesis chapter 41, verse 2, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. So kine, are basically water cows. And we see here from the text that they are well-favored, and they're fat-fleshed, and they fed in the meadow. So what we can tell by that is this is a positive part of the dream, because they're pretty much, they're big, they're plump, they're good. They're not starving, they're not suffering in any way, but they're well taken care of, well nourished, and their needs are met. So it is a pretty much like a sign, like the symbolism is a positive meaning with this 7 fat, well favored, fat flesh kine. These water cows that are there at the river, and Pharaoh's seeing them. And, that's what you can tell from the text. And when we look at it, and if we were going to try to figure out the meaning of this dream that Pharaoh's having, so far with this part of it, it's good because of its positive, its positive demeanor and its positive type of meaning. And it says right here, Genesis chapter 41, verse 3, "And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river." So here we have a negative meaning. It's pessimistic. It's the opposite of the optimistic 7 fat-fleshed and well-fed kine that were in the beginning. But these 7 other water cows that are ill-favored, skinny, scrawny, and hungry, that they're suffering from that, right? And you can tell from what it's talking about because it says right here, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and they stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. It's a negative meaning, pessimistic, and that's a negative part of the dream when we look into its meaning and the deciphering of what it would be. In Genesis chapter 41, verse 4, "And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine, so Pharaoh awoke." So that number 7 is very significant with what it's to be. We know that 7 pops up twice right here. And because it popped up twice, it just has a very significant meaning. And in this case, it's as a timeline similar to the chief butler and chief baker's dreams, because they had these, just that number of the fat water cows, then the number of the skinny, ill-favored water cows. And pretty much what you see from that is that, you could see that it's as the passage of time again, or that it would be something like that, just because of the other dreams that Joseph interpreted of the chief butler and the chief baker. And then these ill-favored ones just consumed the 7 well-favored ones and the fat ones as if they've never been there at all. That's a very pessimistic admonition, which means warning, like it's to get your attention, and it's to all these things, like God speaking to the subconscious of Pharaoh's mind, basically telling him what he's going to do. So look what happens next in Genesis chapter 41, verse 5. "And he slept and dreamed the second time, and behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good." So he woke up, and then here he is again, and this time it's 7 ears of corn came up rank upon one stalk, rank and good. So, things we could take note of, it's Pharaoh, and it's pertaining to, pretty much things that would be of value, the cows and the ears of corn. And it's just noteworthy symbolisms in the dream. And says right here, and he slept and dreamed the second time, and behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. So they came up from one stalk, rank and good. They were good, well favored ears of corn, very similar to his first dream that he had. And then again, the next thing that happens here, Genesis chapter 41, verse 6. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. So, thin ears of corn, blasted with the east wind. So pretty much they're like the ill-favored kind, the ill-favored water cows. They're just thin ears of corn and blasted with the east wind. Basically, what I believe that to mean is kind of like scorched up and just not, they're not as good as those 7 first ears of corn. Because when it talks about blasted with the east wind, there's other indications where it talks about, I think it has to do with their desert climate, something to do with when this east wind comes, it just gets hotter and, blasted with the east wind, like not really scorched, but just that the corn is withered at this point. And it has something to do with that. I'm not entirely certain with that part of it, but blasted with the east wind, basically it has something to do with negative effects of the weather, and it's the outcome of what the corn was. And when we continue, after these ones sprung up, Genesis chapter 41, verse 7, it says this, and the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So, just like the chief butler and the chief baker, this dream that he had, both of these dreams, practically dreaming the same thing, it's just gnawing on him in his soul. And he's worried about it and stuff. He's trying to figure out what it means because it ties in with some kind of fate, and he knows that deep down because it's just that type of serious dream, and he felt the effects of God's admonition for him. And an interesting fact too, the fact that the dream was doubled, the same meanings repeated twice, is a symbolism that it's established by God, and also that, pretty much it will surely and shortly come to pass within the time that it said it will come to pass, which Joseph will interpret and predict. And I'll just wait till we get there with Joseph's interpretation of what the dream fully means. And, he has that. Again, he's probably just basically, like, wouldn't say distraught, totally freaking out, but, the king of Egypt is probably troubled. He's weary of what's going on. It's gnawing on him because he knows that it just means something, that there's something to this dream. There's something to what's taking place in his head, and he has to pretty much figure out what it is, and he doesn't know what to do to figure it out. So, as it says right here, Genesis chapter 41, verse 8, and it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men thereof, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. So, they're wise men, they're magicians, even the priests, like any sort of divination that they would use for this cause just to figure out what in the world's going on in his dream. And nobody can tell him what his dream means. and he's just troubled by it. It says right here, none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Nobody could interpret Pharaoh's dreams and what they meant. Out of all their wise men, out of all the things of man, the answer couldn't be given from man, at least not accurately, because it was not of man. And it was of the Most High God that gave the dream, and it was of the Most High God that you'd get the interpretation of the meaning. So who better to ask than Joseph, the Semite slave that was in prison and in Pharaoh's prison house and his dungeon, that, you know, he put all of his prisoners and pretty much all the high status people that would be there, like the chief butler and baker. They were both there, and they were put in ward there. But now they want this Semite slave because of what his ability is, which we haven't got even that far yet. But they're going to want Joseph because not only is he this Hebrew Semite slave that's just stuck in the dungeons, you know, just waiting it out until he gets out of there, which in his case probably would have been never. You know, he was an offense to one of Pharaoh's officers, his high-ranking members, and he was put in that prison. It probably would have been for life, and that's probably what he would have endured. But, you know, Joseph, he's more than just a Semite slave or any kind of slave, but he was also the king of dreams. And with him came the interpretations because of the Spirit of God that indwelled and lived within him, gave him the gift and the ability to interpret the dreams. So, you know, that being said, you know, nobody could interpret it, and it had to pretty much go and be upon Joseph. And all of this is according to God's plan. And we see that it's better that that chief butler didn't, you know, try to get him out of prison and go his way, because God's way was way better for Joseph. And what all he gets, and he gets a lot of special blessings that, you know, yeah, Pharaoh and whatnot was part of it and getting it, but really the hand that was involved that gave him all this was the hand of Almighty God, the hand of Yahweh and the Most High. And that was who blessed Joseph with all that he gets blessed with in the very near future from where we're at, that we're rapidly approaching. That, you know, we'll see it in the next few videos here. But that's the story for right here, and you all have a blessed day.